For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. I'm at the Africa Institute of South Africa to discuss the potential of social media to impact the socio-political change on the African continent. Firstly, can you briefly explain what social media is and how it is possible for this to influence socio-political change?
I think it's a very broad term, social media, and it's to a certain extent a term that many people want to use. But I mean, just from a sort of a very generic definition of it, it's basically tools and services that allow people to create, share knowledge and information on a very broad sort of level, and it's the fact that it's internet or web-based means that people do not always have to log into a specific portal or host site, which is good. The first of these services that we've seen in our sort of modern daytime is obviously Facebook, that we all know very well, and current statistics tells us that in the past 11 years since Facebook has been launched, there's about 600, or just over 600 million users. Interestingly enough, the countries in Africa with the highest number of Facebook users, also the highest or the fastest growth of Facebook users, is actually Egypt and South Africa. So that's one of the first indications, if you look at that, why things in Egypt have been sort of happening as fast as they actually have happened over the past 2 months that we've seen. In the past years, sort of after Facebook has seen the light, there's been other new technological developments that has created services that are under a broad term now referred to as being called live streaming, and live streaming basically just is exactly what it says. It gives people the opportunity to basically stream or broadcast their life in a very active, as it happens type of way. I think the most important thing to mention when we start saying that it has been able to influence, or at least have the potential to influence, socio-political change and the politics of a state to some extent, is the fact that it has created a tool for mobilization.
What role did social media play in the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions?
I think, connected to what Charles said, the issue of cell phones or mobile phones is a very important one, because they are the platforms that predominantly played a role. The reason for this is that personal computers are not readily accessible on the continent yet, but cell phones have penetrated. So in the Tunisian revolution, or what is known as the Jasmine Revolution, as well as in Tahrir Square in Cairo, where the focus of Al Jazeera was, cell phones were used as mobile tools to mobilize. And so young people, but also old, across the board, were communicating with one another, organizing to get together. And Facebook, in a sense, played the role that instigated a lot of what had happened. Both revolutions were initiated as a result of reports on Facebook pages of the deaths of political dissidents. And so people became aware, not only in Egypt and Tunisia, but also across the globe, about state violence and police brutality. And things had been going quite badly up until then: bad socioeconomic circumstances, political dissatisfaction in both Tunisia and Egypt. So it seems as if it was just the trigger that was needed. And then this spread like wildfire. People were saying that even intelligence agencies across the world weren't expecting what had happened in Tunisia and Egypt. So it was very sudden, and there were successful revolutions. I think what was needed was that the people wanted a say in what was happening. They had leaders, dictators, for 30 to 40 years, ruling their everyday lives. Many youth were unemployed, poverty rife. Lack of freedom of expression was a problem in both countries. And so people rose up, and the tools that they used were Facebook and Twitter predominantly. It was interesting to see how there was also a momentum, and that momentum was maintained. 16 days in Tahrir Square, people thought that the activists, the dissidents, the protesters were going to become tired, that they were going to lose hope. But there was this momentum, and I believe that the momentum was also caused by the fact that people around the globe were spreading this news, and that there was international sympathy for what was happening. So it just maintained the momentum of the protests in both countries, and I think that's quite exciting in the sense that we always talk about a global village, but this really has gone across borders and beyond boundaries, in the sense that people, they are sitting at home and they're not in physical danger themselves, but they do relate to what is happening in the streets of African countries. And that is, to me, a very exciting development in terms of just the way the world communicates, because a lot of misunderstandings are caused by cultural differences. So when we see live streaming, then we see young people in the streets saying that they want lives that are free of oppression. We can relate to that. So in terms of that, social media was something that just allowed this public protest to occur. It wasn't anything that actually caused it. It wasn't an original cause, but it did light the fire. And this spread, and as I say, in terms of international support, for example, when both of the leaders of Tunisia and Egypt decided to try and block the internet and cell phones, there was speak to tweet that was introduced. You know, people could phone certain telephone numbers, speak their message, and this would be tweeted by others outside the country. So the messages were still coming across, and to that extent I believe that we can say now that freedom of expression is becoming a far more entrenched right, because you can close down newspapers, you can shut down television stations, but you most certainly can't stop people from communicating with one another. And I think for the African continent, that's wonderful.
You mentioned two arguments against the idea that social media can make a difference in the national politics of a state. Can you tell us more, as well as the many constraints and challenges in Africa regarding access to mobile telephone technology and internet connectivity?
These two arguments comes from an article that was written in the latest issue of the Foreign Affairs magazine in the United States by a person called Clay Shirky, who's a professor of new media at the New York University. These, to a certain extent, critiques of social media comes into this article then. And the first of these are that these tools themselves can actually be ineffective. And the second then is that these tools can also be harmful to the process of democratization. I'll get to that now. The first one of these critiques, namely the fact that the tools themselves can be ineffective, comes from someone by the name of Malcolm Gladwell that has written in the New Yorker magazine. His argument stems from the fact that in many of these social actions and social revolutions, if you want to call it that, there are participants in these events that are less serious than others when it comes to the change that they actually want from these events. And this he calls casual participants to the events. And a casual participant can be someone that can put a bumper sticker on his or her car, and then that person thinks, now I've made a difference because I've put a bumper sticker on my car. It can be someone that can join a specific Facebook group, and by simply only joining and then sitting back and not doing anything else, this person can think that I've made a difference now. And these casual participants do it in this sort of way because it doesn't cost them a lot of money, and it also doesn't cost them a lot of time to do it. So what Malcolm Gladwell then says is that these participants to actions such as that can actually not make a difference, and their actions can actually not bring about any useful action. But so then Clay Shirky, again, as the author of this article, says that it's a very correct critique to use, because these sort of casual participants does not bring about any useful action in how they do it. But we cannot then say that because of the fact that you do find people that are sort of less interested and less committed to a certain extent to what they want to do, we cannot go now say that there are not people that exist that are very serious about it. And we cannot say that people who indeed are serious about it and who indeed are committed cannot actually bring about any change and cannot actually bring about any or make any difference in what is happening. So that's the one side, that you do get people that are very committed, and you do get people that are less committed. On the other side, it's important to realize that in the 21st century of today, governments themselves and the state as an entity are becoming more powerful, and they are having increasingly sophisticated means of dealing with what people are doing in their state. So they have technologically more advanced and more sophisticated tools of monitoring and also interdicting what people are doing through social media. Professor Nani has mentioned that, if some of these leaders have started, when the revolutions have gone too far, they started to simply block some of these sites or block some of the networks. So states do become more influential in the fact that they actually have the tools and the technology now to also combat what people are trying to do. And in many cases, authoritarian states in the world are increasingly now today shutting down these networks and grids to deny people the opportunity to actually use them for the sake of bringing about change in the way that their lives eventually are lived. In terms of challenges then, bringing it back to Africa again, or sort of to where we find ourselves today, internet connectivity as such, through the traditional way of doing it through cables under the sea and doing it through wired connections are today still very underdeveloped on the African continent, and we need to realize that there are some countries where it's stronger. Where we sit now in South Africa, obviously we have a lot better infrastructure in terms of these things due to a number of reasons than many other countries. But most countries on the African continent still lacks this infrastructure, and that is why people resort to using their mobile phones. In a recent report by the World Bank that was released in 2009, they make the statement that African governments, also in sub-Saharan Africa, have started to invest more in developing their ICT, or information and communication technologies infrastructure, to create a situation where people can have better access to internet and faster access to internet. But it's still not enough, and government still does not have enough money in their budget to actually build this infrastructure up. So people will continue to resort to mobile phones as the choice way of action when it comes to using the internet and using these platforms of social media.
In conclusion, what do you think the political impact of social media will be in Africa in general and South Africa in particular?
I think that was what we wanted to bring across in terms of the piece that we wrote, that this kind of what we can call mobile activism, we don't believe is going to be restricted to North Africa, or the Middle East for that matter. And that there is obviously a lot of potential for it to be used throughout Africa. And if we think about the dictators that we have scattered across the continent, there are obviously leaders that are vulnerable in terms of this kind of activism. So there is mobile penetration or cell phone penetration in the continent. It's growing rapidly. For example, there's even mobile banking now in Africa. So technology is spreading, and through that spread of technology, people across the continent are becoming aware of the changes that are taking place. And so where there are socio-political problems, there may very well be more and more voices joining in the fray. We can only think of, well, SADC, Southern African region. Robert Mugabe has been in power now for, I think, more than 30 years. Although we're not seeing much activism in Zimbabwe, and it would be interesting to know why. So South Africa itself, we have service delivery protests, very violent ones, and people here are very connected, as Charles mentioned. The only other African country more connected than we are is Egypt. So in terms of that, I think that what our recommendations are is that governments should become more constructive in terms of their own response to and use of social media. Because if we talk about democracy, we talk about participation usually, that the people of the country participate in the governance of that country. And that is something that seems to be what young people want in particular. They want more of a say. And so the more voices that are raised in terms of these platforms, the more governments need to know how to respond to these demands in such a way that it doesn't lead to a revolution. You know, giving you an extreme example. Of course, Charles mentioned a very big problem in that governments can also begin to manipulate social media. You know, you get newspapers full of propaganda, you get television stations that are publishing propaganda, and you could very well have authoritarian governments using social media in a negative way. However, there are ways in which we can see people overcoming this kind of authoritarian position that governments are taking. And we have organizations very controversial, such as Anonymous, who actually protect the right to freedom of speech of hackers on the internet. So they are sort of the big brother involved in all of this as well. And then we have Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, although we haven't heard much about that recently. So there are a lot of people that are keeping watch over what is happening. And therefore, in situations where governments are democratic, and so that Jacob Zuma has mentioned that he doubts very much that a revolution of this type would happen in South Africa, because as our president, he says, we are a constitutional democracy. However, there is dissatisfaction. So one shouldn't just sit back and say everything's okay in a situation like that. I would recommend, and I think Charles together with me, is that government should actually interact with her citizens via social media. Policy updates would be an important thing to communicate via Twitter. In actual fact, the Canadian government has started to do that very successfully. Just sharing information is very important, because one of the things that citizens are most dissatisfied about is that they don't have information. So the sharing of information is very important, and merely just listening to the voices of their citizens. And of course, everybody actually who resides in the country. The whole issue of listening to voices is a very democratic principle. It's based on participatory democracy and the ability for people to influence government policy. And, you know, as the Africa Institute, we're very interested in government policy, and that's why we make these recommendations. What is happening is cutting edge. It is something that we cannot ignore. And instead of responding in a conservative manner towards these developments, rather to be proactive about what is happening and actually to use these mechanisms in a positive manner to respond to social needs. And in this way, people may become far more satisfied with the fact that they are living in a democracy, a true constitutional democracy. The preamble of our constitution states that everybody's entitled to a better life. And really it boils down to that. At the end of the day, we heard those cries from both Tunisia and Egypt, a better life for all. And we should, as citizens, demand that and actively participate in that. And in that way, we then put pressure on our government to respond to those demands in terms of service delivery, for example. So across Africa, we have service delivery problems. We have countries that are not democratic in nature. We have human rights abuses occurring. And hopefully, because of this growth in mobile technology and in social media, people will have more and more of an opportunity to voice their concerns. These will echo around the world, even to the couch potatoes who don't care much. This kind of activism has been going on for a very long time, actually. I was just thinking of yesterday was the day of not wearing shoes. It's a symbolic stance that is taken to illustrate empathy and sympathy for human suffering and oppression. I think that's very important. Just a last word about the whole issue of freedom of expression. There is a little bit of controversy going on the continent in terms of media freedom. Recently, last week in South Sudan, there was a clampdown on newspapers. Newspapers were actually confiscated after they had been distributed. There are many governments who don't want the truth to come out. We have government newspapers. And so the issue of media freedom is very important. South Africa has always been the leader in terms of freedom of expression on the continent. However, as I'm sure you know, in the last year or so, there have been serious concerns about the creation of media tribunal, the protection of information bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, which actually criminalizes investigative journalism. So it's just, in terms of that development, I think it's something that is totally contrary to what people want. People want more openness, more transparency, more accountability from their governments. And so this kind of censorship is most certainly something that isn't going to be welcomed in South Africa or on the continent. And we need to move beyond that kind of restrictive measure and rather try and be productive in terms of how we deal with media, especially since if people can't express themselves in official ways, they will do so in terms of unofficial ways, the social media that we've been describing on the continent.